Well, hi there. This is what you would call a penguin. Look at it. What a wonderful creature. These are probably the best known flightless birds, at least outside of this clade, which includes things like ostriches, emus, cassowaries, and their closest relatives, the paleognathi. That video is awesome, by the way, and you should watch it next. Interestingly, despite being possibly the two most recognizable flightless birds, there is no bird more distantly related to an ostrich than is a penguin. And this might not come as a big surprise. I mean, other than being flightless birds, ostriches and penguins, they don't really have much in common. If I had to guess what the closest relatives of penguins were, I probably would have guessed something like these. Or even more so, other types of auks, like these. I mean, look at the great auk. It's a relatively large, flightless, black and white, fish-eating bird that swam underwater using its tiny wings for propulsion. In fact, the great auk is the original penguin. When what we call penguins today were discovered, given that they look to be, well, basically the same thing, they started calling them penguins as well. I mean, wouldn't you? But it turns out that these new penguins, they weren't really penguins at all. OG penguins are more closely related to hummingbirds than they are to false penguins. Though OGPs are much more closely related to seagulls than they are to hummingbirds. And false penguins, which I shall largely refer to henceforth as penguins, though we'll all know that they're imposters, are more closely related to flamingos and to this bird, which has clawed fingers on its wings. And this finger-winged bird looks like something that is only alive today thanks to John Hammond.
Spared no expense.
So I guess what I'm saying is that I had no idea how penguins fit in with the other birds. And I was particularly surprised when I learned that their closest living relatives are possibly the birds that are the best at flying of any bird in the world. And their close relatives also include some of my other favorite birds in the world. But not necessarily the birds I would have suspected to be the close relatives of penguins, because they look nothing like penguins, which are on my short list of favorite of all birds. A few years ago, I had the incredible privilege of being accepted into penguin society. I am really struggling not to call them false penguins now that, well, I know the truth. Yeah, I can't do it. Just because we plucked the true penguins into extinction, which is horrifying and stupid as well as true, that doesn't mean that they lost their title as penguins. Anyway, I was accepted into false penguin society. I was like a false penguin, which, if I understand anything about double negatives, pretty much makes me a penguin.
Hey, my name is not Oswald! It's Penguin! I am not a human being! I am an animal! Cold-blooded! Crank the AC!
Penguins, false penguins, humans, and lots of other animals are warm-blooded, just for the record, Oswald. Anyway, it was a very special event that I will never forget. And though I've never been to Antarctica, I have seen false penguins in the wild. And this is because, surprisingly to many people from the northern hemisphere, false penguins live in coastal waters in many places across the southern hemisphere, not just in Antarctica. The first wild penguins I ever saw were Humboldt penguins, also known as Peruvian penguins, while I was living in the coastal Peruvian city of Mollendo, one of my favorite places in the world. Though they're also found in places that I've since visited, like Australia and New Zealand. And we've been invited to visit our friend Dingo Dinkelman in South Africa, another place with penguins. And if you'd like to see us go there, please consider supporting us on Patreon. If you'd like to come with us, let us know in the comments, and we might be able to make it happen. Anyway, what I'm saying is that penguins are on every continent in the southern hemisphere. Even though penguins, true penguins, OGPs, lived exclusively in the northern hemisphere. Oh, and just for the record, in our video about the sketchiest clade of birds, the gallo and sere, I mentioned that in Spanish, peacocks are called pavo real, meaning real turkeys. And I have been corrected by countless Spanish speakers because the word real in Spanish can also mean royal. And in many cases, it would be royal. It makes sense, given how much more regal they tend to look than do Ben Franklin's noble friends. But in this case, it does mean real turkey. Probably more accurately, real peacock. Because peacocks were pavo for centuries before any Spanish speaker ever saw a turkey. And in the same way that you might see a false penguin and think, that's gotta be a penguin, it's not that unreasonable to see a turkey and call it the name of the most similar creature you have ever seen. But turkeys are false peacocks, which is why they still specify if they mean peacocks or real peacocks today. But right now, we need to talk about penguins, because they are amazing, and it isn't their fault that we call them something that they're not and then drove that thing to extinction to fill our pillows and our pocketbooks. Penguins are amazing. There are between 17 and 20 extant species, depending on who you ask, though obviously the correct answer is 0. But there are between 17 and 20 extant species of false penguins, ranging in size from the 35-kilo emperor penguin, which stands just over a meter high, to possibly my favorite false penguin, the little blue, which is only about 33 centimeters tall and weighs 1.2 to 1.3 kilos. Sometimes I say their sizes using multiple systems of weights and measures, and sometimes we just put alternatives on the screen. Today we're going to do the latter, at least generally, but let me know what you prefer in the comments. Anyway, emperor penguins are about 2.16 cubits tall and weigh just over a Babylonian talent. Meanwhile, little blues are just 39 barleycorns tall and weigh just a touch over 5.5 cologne marks. All 17 to 20 species of false penguins are in the family Sphenicidae, as opposed to true penguins, which are in the family Alcidae, and the genus Penguinus, because they're penguins. But sphenicids, false penguins, they definitely need a whole video at some point. I need to take you through every species, if for no other reason than just to find out if the little blue is actually my favorite penguin, because there are some rad ones, like the king penguin, prettier cousin of the emperor, or the macaroni penguin, which actually is named after noodles, and may just be a color variant of the royal penguin, because unlike peacocks, false penguins are nobility. Or the Galapagos penguin, the only false penguin that dabbles in the northern hemisphere. False penguins, like their legit distant relatives, are very unusual birds. For one thing, for a flightless bird, they do spend a lot of time flying, just not through air. But unlike most swimming birds, they propel themselves through the water, principally with their wings. And gentoo penguins, the false penguins that, by their acceptance, made me a penguin, are the fastest underwater birds in the world. They can go up to about 36 kilometers per hour, which is about 4 times as fast as Michael Phelps, and should probably be a unit of measure. So they fly at about 3.7 Phelpses underwater, which is a hard place to fly. Just ask all of the other birds and bats and insects. I really don't think they have a rival. I don't think there is any other lineage of flying animals that has evolved faster underwater flight than false penguins. Though I don't know how fast penguins were. Not only are they fast, but they can dive to extreme depths. The bigger they are, the deeper they can dive. Emperor penguins can dive to a depth of 550 meters, which is 3.5 times the world record depth for a free-diving human, and the deepest ever recorded for a dinosaur. We're making that false penguin video. But we haven't even gotten to what the closest relatives of false penguins are, other than to say that they might be the best flying birds in the world, and that they aren't penguins, which are auks, which are most closely related to seagulls, which are honestly what I would have thought to be the closest relatives to the closest relatives of false penguins. These. I mean, you see that, and then I ask you, is that more closely related to a penguin or a seagull? Okay, maybe I don't ask you this, because you would probably guess that if I was asking, it's because the answer is crazy. But if your kid asked you if that was more closely related to a penguin or a seagull, and like every parent at the zoo, you felt that you had to give an answer even if you had no idea, what would you say? You'd have to be crazy to go penguin. Now, in fairness, it is equally related to both penguins and seagulls, but assuming that your kid meant false penguin, then the answer would be penguin, right? Though, if you get a good look at their heads, their feet, or especially their DNA, starts to seem a little less crazy. But not in that I should have known kind of way, more like in the, I guess I see it now, at least now that you mention it, kind of way. And if they only look like distant cousins, keep in mind that they diversified from the ancestors of false penguins before the non-avian dinosaurs went extinct. Which means that if we ever find a late Cretaceous non-avian theropod with a bird that looks a bit like a penguin or an albatross in its stomach, don't let it blow your mind. So what are these? Well, they're not seagulls. They're part of the order Procellariiformes, the 4 families of albatrosses and petrels, often collectively called the tube noses due to their tube noses, as opposed to the false penguin heads, a name I proposed that was swiftly rejected. Unlike their cousins, the false penguins, which are serial monogamists like Leonardo DiCaprio, tube noses form long-term pair bonds that may last for life. And they tend to breed in huge colonies in locations generally isolated from predators, which is why invasive predators can be so devastating to them. Add to that the fact that since predation hasn't been much of an issue for them historically, they produce few but large offspring, for reasons that I would be happy to explain in a future video. This was the subject of my master's thesis work. So feel free to write, "Teach me about life, history, evolution" in the comments, if you're into that kind of thing. But tube noses only produce 1 chick every nesting attempt. And they generally only nest once a year, sometimes only every 2 years. So I think you see the problem. But I also think I've left you hanging about long enough about their tube noses. Why do they have tube noses? Well, it has to do with their excellent sense of smell, especially those that nest in burrows. This exceptional sense of smell allows them to smell, among other things, dimethyl sulfide, which is released by large concentrations of plankton. And where there is plankton, there is often all sorts of ocean life. And where there is no plankton, in the open ocean, there ain't nothing but water. Salt water, which they can drink because of their enlarged nasal glands that allow them to snot rocket that salt right out of them tubes. The reason that smell is extra important for burrow nesters is because they likely find their nests by smell, as opposed to surface nesters that do so by sight, and thus see much better than burrow nesters, but don't smell as well. And almost none of them walk well. If you think that false penguins look silly walking on land, watch a Procellariiform try to go for a stroll. With their feet that are remarkably similar in structure to their cousins, having 3 fully webbed front-facing toes with a highly reduced or non-existent hind toe. But, like false penguins, they make up for this terrible land walking ability by being exceptional flyers. This time in air, not water. And while I would probably argue that they are the best flyers of all birds, I would also argue that they might be the worst of all flying birds. And if I was going to make this argument for any one family of tube noses, it would probably be for the biggest of the tube noses. The family least related to the other 3 extant families, the family Diomediidae, the roughly 21 species of albatrosses. They are the greatest flyers of all birds. And they have the longest wingspans of any bird, with some getting up to 3.7 meters, which for comparison is over 13 hands longer than that of the golden eagle, which has a wingspan of no more than about 2.3 meters. That said, the structure is completely different. We described the structure and function of eagle wings in our video about raptors. You know, hooked-billed birds with grabby murder feet. They are well adapted to low-speed soaring. Well, not these. These are built for a whole different kind of soaring. Because hot air isn't the only way to get high for cheap. High isn't the only way to fly, and slow isn't the only way to go. Which is why albatrosses have very narrow but very long wings. Very long means lots of lift, which counteracts gravity. Important if you're gonna fly. Something eagles have in spades. Very narrow means little drag, which counteracts thrust. This is where they're different from eagles. They aren't just lofty, they're lofty fast. Not great for searching for things to eat far down on the ground, but perfect for patrolling the vast near emptiness of the open ocean for months and even years without returning to land. Of course, narrow wings do have a cost that we'll discuss later. And there is a real problem. Flapping flight is more energetically costly than running. And how long can you possibly run through a big blue desert, sniffing around for occasional morsels of food, without dying? I guess it depends on whether or not you're moving your legs. Because if you're basically holding still and still somehow moving ridiculously fast and you can drink salt water and shoot it out of your tube, then the big blue becomes a lot more hospitable. Albatrosses can cover nearly 1,000 kilometers in a day without flapping their wings because of witchcraft, which is an easy answer. Or dynamic soaring, which is a correct answer that is a bit harder to wrap your head around. We spoke before of circling behavior in vultures as they remain inside of columns of hot air-cooled thermals. That works great, as long as there are patches of hot air and you aren't trying to get anywhere but high. But as soon as you pop out of that thermal, you better find another one, quickly, or start flapping your brains out because you're going down. And there aren't a lot of major thermals in the open ocean, but there is a lot of wind. Problem is that wind isn't always going up. In fact, it normally isn't. Though it will sometimes, like when it hits a wave, an albatross will ride that rising air and gain some altitude and speed. This is called slope soaring. But dynamic soaring is a bit more complicated than that. Honestly, I've been trying to wrap my head around it since I first learned of its existence many years ago. Because the way that it has always been explained to me just didn't quite add up. Unless you have an albatross that is not impacted by friction or gravity. A perpetual motion machine with tube nostrils. But I'm going to tell you how an American kestrel helped me understand a little more what's really going on. But the first key to dynamic soaring is a vertical gradient in wind speed. That wind travels faster as you get farther from the surface of the ocean. Which tends to be the case as the surface of the water and the waves can serve to slow down the air and its impact is reduced as you get higher above the ocean surface. When I see explanations of dynamic soaring, they usually start close to the water, but it makes very little sense if you start there. So let's start up high, where wind speeds are the highest. From up high, the albatross will dive, turning its potential energy from altitude into kinetic energy as it gains speed, as well as being pushed by the wind itself. It dives with the wind to its back. And this works great as long as you have altitude to spare and you're happy with whatever direction the wind is pushing. But obviously, this isn't going to carry you for 1,000 kilometers. So they turn as they approach the ocean, where the wind is weak, and turn right back into the wind, exchanging their kinetic energy for altitude. Once they have bled most of their velocity and gained maximum altitude without flapping, they make another turn and head back down, and the pattern begins again. A long series of S-shaped turns down with the wind and up into the wind over and over for thousands of kilometers at a time. Again, it sounds great as long as the albatross is a perpetual motion machine. But if the albatross cannot turn absolutely every bit of energy gained by traveling with the wind into energy to travel against the wind, and every bit of kinetic energy gained by diving into potential energy gained by climbing, then at some point, not so far down the ocean road, that bird's coming down. And this is what has perplexed me for a very long time, and something that many scientists have wrestled with for their entire lives without understanding. Which is almost as bad as being eaten alive with your palpables full, if you know what I mean. And while I'm sure I'm not the first one to understand a little more of what's going on, I can tell you that I think it is starting to come together for me because of something a little birdie taught me. One of my favorite little birdies, to be precise, the aforementioned American kestrel. One of the neatest experiences I have ever had with a kestrel was one I had one day in my friend Andrew's front yard. It was a really windy day. And there was a kestrel about 10 feet away from me and 8 feet in the air, lagging out. It was just hovering there. Not flapping, not moving up, not moving down, not going forward, not going backward, just frozen there in the air, going nowhere at all. And just for the record, it was facing into this stiff headwind. Now, I don't want to dismiss the possibility that both this and dynamic soaring could be cases of witchcraft, but I think I have a better explanation. Obviously, the bird was using the wind passing over the airfoil of the wing to generate enough lift to overcome the force of gravity. That's why it wasn't falling. But why wasn't it being pushed backward? My best take is that it was using the airfoil of the wing not only to generate lift, but also to generate thrust. And this is possible due to Bernoulli's principle. Because of the shape of an airfoil, fluid, in this case air, travels faster over the top of the wing than it does the bottom, because the distance to travel over the top is greater than the distance over the bottom. Because the air is moving faster over the top, it generates a decrease in pressure. This is Bernoulli's principle. And because the pressure below the wing is higher, it attempts to equalize the pressure, but is blocked by the wing itself, and thus it pushes up on the wing itself. Of course, this is only true if the wing is moving through the air, or in this case, if the air is moving past the wing. And by tilting the wing slightly forward, it not only serves to lift the bird enough to counteract gravity, but also to counteract the drag generated by the wind passing over the bird. So it was just hovering in place, only making slight adjustments to its wing pitch as the winds changed, and getting an amazing look around while expending little energy. And this, I feel, is at least part of the answer to my problem with dynamic soaring. Because perpetual motion, it's not possible. To keep something in motion, you need an input of energy. And in this case, the input of energy is the wind itself, even when it's a headwind. Though I do suspect that this type of hovering may require at least some degree of an updraft. So perhaps the last piece of the puzzle has to do with the fact that an albatross is likely more aerodynamic from the front than the back, sort of like a doorstop. If a doorstop with wings is flying into the wind, the impact of the wind on the doorstop will be minimal. But once it turns away from the wind, the blunt side of the doorstop will be impacted considerably more by the wind. Meaning that over the same distance, the doorstop receives more energy from the wind as it faces away than it loses to the wind when flying into it. Albatrosses could also time their turns so that they're generally going with the wind when gusts are strongest. And I've heard that they may also use thermals to some degree, but I've only seen that once, though it was from the Audubon Society. And they may be only able to do this when their overall trajectory is at least to some degree downwind. So it's starting to come together for me. But this has only not made sense to me since I first learned about it almost 20 years ago. Almost all of the explanations that I've ever heard for albatross flight are just the perpetual motion model. I'd love your thoughts down in the comments. Perhaps we don't have to die with our palpal bulbs full. But however it works, flight of this type requires a very precise ability to detect shifts in wind speed. Aircraft measure wind speeds using a device called a pitot tube. If only albatrosses and other tube-nosed birds had a tube somewhere. I think you see where I'm going. Well, it turns, and turn is a perfect word for this, it turns out that the tube noses are handy for more than just smelling out food and nesting sites and shooting the occasional salt rocket. In albatrosses, the tubes are a bit less conspicuous as they sit on the sides of the bill as opposed to on top. But they're there, and they make perfect pitot tubes. So this is why albatrosses are possibly the best flying birds in the world. Then how are they even possibly the worst of all flying birds? Well, have you ever seen one try to take off? Truth is, they almost can't do it at all. We talked about the short elliptical wings of burst flying birds in this rather unforgettable video. If you're going to be good at getting off the ground, what you want is exactly the opposite of long skinny wings. And the albatrosses may be the closest of all flighted birds not being able to pull it off. In fact, without a running start or a strong wind, I doubt they could ever get into the air at all to play their games with the laws of thermodynamics.
Sure wish we'd have taken the train.
The remaining three families of tube noses can be distinguished from albatrosses by the location of their nose tube, which is situated on the top of the beak instead of the sides. They also tend to be somewhat smaller than are the albatrosses, though some are still fairly large. And their beaks don't tend to be as strongly hooked as those of albatrosses. Of these remaining three, the family most distantly related to the other two are the 10 species of austral storm petrels of the family Oceanitidae, which, to be honest, you will never confuse with albatrosses, if for no other reason than that they are among the smallest of all seabirds. I could see you confusing one for a plover or a killdeer. I could even see you confusing them for some sort of an open sea pigeon, but not an albatross. If you see an austral storm petrel and you think, gosh, Is that an albatross? Then you are entirely too focused on the nose, and you even forgot that albatross's tubes are on the sides of the beak. However, good on you for noticing the tube. That will keep you from confusing it with any of the other birds that actually do look very similar. Very unlike albatrosses, they have short wings and very long legs. They are the longest legs, at least proportionally to their body, of any tube-nosed birds. Though they're very weak, so they are still terrible at walking. On land, that is. Because though you will not confuse them with albatrosses, they still practice witchcraft. Not dynamic soaring, but something I would like to call wave dancing. Perhaps with a touch of sea hopping when the waves get intense. Yeah, they just kind of use their wings to generate enough lift so that they don't sink as they dance across the surface of the ocean, picking up little morsels of food as they drift by. The actual name of this style of locomotion is surface patterning, and honestly, while I think that's a touch less descriptive than what it actually looks like, it's a dang adorable name and it gets my seal of approval. Absolutely magical little birds. Their closest relatives are the two remaining families of tube-nosed birds. The 99 species of fulmarine petrels, gadfly petrels, diving petrels, prions, and shearwaters of the family Procellariidae, and the 18 species of northern storm petrels of the family Hydrobatidae. And don't confuse the northern storm petrels for the austral storm petrels. While northern storm petrels are among the closest living relatives of austral storm petrels, the northern storm petrels are more closely related to the Procellariids than they are to the austral storm petrels. And I'll start with the Procellariids just to put some space between the two groups called storm petrels so you don't get them too mixed up in your brain. So, fulmarine petrels, gadfly petrels, diving petrels, prions, and shearwaters. This is obviously the biggest family of tube noses, and the biggest family that we've discussed so far, even including the false penguins. Though false penguins do get larger than Procellariids. But there are some big Procellariids. Giant petrels can have a wingspan of around 2 meters. A bird that you could actually confuse with an albatross if you forgot where the tubes go. That said, there are also tiny members of this family. Diving petrels, for example, have a wingspan of only about 34 centimeters. And interestingly, they are very morphologically similar to a type of auk called a little auk, a close relative of penguins, where diving petrels are close relatives of false penguins. So lots of convergence between these two clades. And Procellariidae is definitely the most diverse family of tube-nosed birds. And that tube nose will help you distinguish a diving petrel from a little auk. You won't confuse them with austral storm petrels because they have longer, thinner wings and shorter legs. But don't worry, they still stink at walking. Many are great swimmers though. And the giant petrels can actually get around on land. Due to the position of their legs and their lack of strength, most of the others rest on their breast muscles and scoot a bit like the tobogganing locomotion of their cousins, the false penguins. You know, where they slide on their bellies. Their wing shape means that these birds travel more like albatrosses generally, and less like dancing sea fairies. And giant petrels share an attribute with albatrosses that allows them to lock their shoulders to take stress off of their muscles while they're busy, not flapping at all. In a nutshell, if you see a tube-nosed bird, and it isn't an albatross or a sea dancer, it's probably one of these. You're not going to confuse them with their closest relatives, the northern storm petrels. And the reason that you're not going to confuse them with northern storm petrels is for the same reason that northern storm petrels were previously lumped in with the austral storm petrels. They're tiny little wave dancers. The easiest way to tell them apart is generally by knowing which hemisphere you're in. If Christmas happens in the summer, it's probably an austral storm petrel. If it happens in the winter, a northern storm petrel. If you're near the equator and you're like, what are summer and winter? You might need to look a little closer. And it isn't impossible to see them cross into the rival hemisphere from time to time, which could lead to some killer dance-offs. Somehow, northern storm petrels are even smaller than their summer Santa counterparts. These are the smallest of all seabirds. They also have longer wings, somewhat forked tails, and shorter legs, though their legs are still pretty long. So that forked tail and knowing what direction the moon is facing are probably the best ways for you to tell which one you're looking at. Though the tail is more foolproof than the moon, which is a sentence I've never uttered before. But here we are. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm sorry I had to be the one to break the bad news to you about penguins. But at least it gave us a great opportunity to talk about some of the most amazing birds in the world. What group should we talk about next? As always, like and subscribe, and we hope to see you real soon. Eat every piece of stuff that I have in this pocket.
What the heck?
That's one pocket.
That's one pocket?
No,
Pants.
that's one pocket. That was these are good pockets.
And you... All right.
This is the best pair of pants ever.
Got some stretch over
I
there.
can sell these pants. Yeah.
Yeah, fanny pack.
Who needs one? Unnecessary. Okay.
Is that 2 sets of keys, a
Three.
Raycon, and a knife, or are you happy to see me?
And a Ridge wallet.
And a
Goodness.
Why can't it be both?